All right, we are live. Hello and welcome to the My RD Journey Podcast. Felicia Peraza of PerazaNutrition.com, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that stuff. Links in the description. My name is Adam, producer and co-host of the My RD Journey Podcast. What are we talking about today?
We're going to talk about preparing for your first client as a dietitian in private practice.
So things you'll need set up in advance, how to go through the session, how to close it, things of that nature. So what are we going to start with? I assume you'll have to get some paperwork in order first and foremost to get things rolling. What would that look like?
Yeah, so paperwork generally, and this can really be up to you, but there's a couple of essential forms that you're going to need.
Maybe not paperwork. Maybe since it's 2020, maybe electronic forms, I guess?
Yeah, so you can do electronic forms. So if you listen to the last podcast, I talked about how I have an electronic record system called Simple Practice.
How to start a private practice.
Yes.
Link in the description, card on the corner of the video right now in the show notes at a link also. It was a full-blown how to start your private practice. We also have why to start a private practice.
Yes.
Links to relevant info in the description.
Yeah. And so with the form, so if you have an electronic record system or if you're looking to get one, which I would highly suggest because it makes things a lot easier on you, one thing you're going to have is you'll be able to have like a client portal. And so that way you can actually send forms electronically. So it'll make it a lot easier. So there's a couple of forms that you're going to want to think about having. So a new client form where you have information about the client, their insurance, HIPAA form. So information about privacy practices, consenting for you to be able to contact them through email, voicemail, or text message, and then also a practice form. So I have a policies form that includes information about my practice, how I bill insurance, and things like that.
Did you mention HIPAA?
Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah. So yeah, links to anything that you may need or may want to reference in the description for this stuff as well. So once you've got your forms, your paperwork, electronic or otherwise, all set up and ready to go, we need to prep for the session. Let's talk about scheduling.
Yeah, so with scheduling, there's a couple of things to kind of consider. So depending on how you have everything set up in your practice, for me, people can schedule through my website, they can email me, or they can call. And so that first kind of scheduling piece, when you're talking to a client or emailing them, you want to confirm a few things. One, how you're going to accept payment from them, or if you're planning on billing insurance and you're an insurance provider, how you're going to collect their information and what things are covered, what types of sessions might be covered. So you want to think about those kinds of logistics, and then where you're going to actually have the session, which if you are an insurance provider, there may be some limitations as to whether or not you could do phone sessions, video, or you need to do face-to-face in like an office setting.
So a couple questions right off the bat. I know that, and this is extremely helpful for me, when I make an appointment for my dentist, usually it's like a month or two in advance, and I get a text reminder and a phone call. Is that what you do too?
So I don't do both. However, I do a text and email reminder. So I only generally call ahead of time if a client hasn't filled out their paperwork. And usually that means that they forgot about the appointment, they haven't accessed the portal to fill out their paperwork, or they're not interested in actually keeping the session. But usually, I have an electronic records, like I mentioned, and the reminders are sent out 72 hours in advance for email and then 24 for the text, which I find to be perfect because, 72 hours, sometimes they're like, oh, I forgot about this and they need to reschedule. Or, the 24 hours, they're like, oh, that's tomorrow. So that's kind of the good time frame.
I feel like that's a good time frame because if it's an email, I don't check my social kind of casual email every day sometimes, but I think the text being something people are more apt to check in a timely manner is a smart thing to do a day in advance. I'm going to be honest, I would prefer the email text over a phone call. I don't like the phone call. It feels a bit intrusive. I usually don't answer anyway and check the voicemail because it's always a number. Well, it shows up as dentist. And who likes that? Anyway, I think that's probably the better thing to do. So when what do you actually do to prepare for the session itself?
So to actually prepare, the first thing I do is I always review the client form. So I have a new client form that I've tweaked over the years. So I include information about, what their goals might be, what their medical history is, what they're hoping to gain from the session. And a couple of key things I look for is, what diets have they might have been on the past? What are their main health concerns? What conditions do they have, which maybe they're going to need some information on? And then what they're actually looking to get out of the session. So a lot of the clients that I have, their first couple of things are, chronic disease management. So diabetes, high cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, those sort of things. And then also weight loss tend to be like huge ones. So I look for those things, which could be potential kind of topic starters for the first session.
I imagine those are all great lily pads to jump off of, or even just starting point. I mean, those are issues that most people are dealing with to some extent. If it's not them, it's a family member or somebody they're close to.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I imagine occasionally you get people who either cancel or want to reschedule. How do you manage that?
So I actually just had a couple of those today. So one, this is where your paperwork comes in. So in my policies form, and I have this actually in the little blurb that people get sent as a reminder that they need to cancel within 24 hours notice, or they get charged, a $15 late cancellation fee or a no-show fee. And I make it clear for my insurance clients that this is not covered under their insurance plan for no-shows for the session. However, I will say that, for the first time, if somebody late cancels or if they, cancel last minute or reschedule within like 24 hours, I'm usually pretty flexible the first time, because sometimes people most people I would say don't read the paperwork and
that's on them. So, you're going easy on them. Your time is money. Be ruthless. I don't know. I'm not a dietitian.
Yeah, and it's so split, because sometimes, and I have charged people late fees. I have charged people for no-show fees. But some, that can really damage the relationship sometimes. And so be prepared to lose a client potentially.
Well, if you lose a low-quality client that is no-showing and canceling, who's the loser?
Well, that's a good point. Like when I first started, I was like, oh, I can't charge. I don't feel really weird about charging. And so I wasn't really sticking to my policies. And then I was finding a lot of people were kind of taking advantage. So then that's where I started putting it more clearly in the paperwork and the reminders. And I started telling people when they scheduled. So now I don't feel bad when I, charge a cancellation fee or no-show fee, because it's been very explicit in all the paperwork, and I made it clear to them and I reminded them of it as well.
Yeah, I don't think you should let people get away with that kind of thing. If it's in black and white, it's in black and white. If they signed it, they signed it. Mm-hmm. When you were coming up and when you deal with other industries, people don't generally give you that kind of leeway. If you cancel or you incur a loss for them with timing and everything like that, your time is valuable. You should absolutely be compensated. I think you should rule with an iron fist there. I think if you let people get away with things, that sets a precedent that could probably damage the reputation of maybe your practice, or at the very least, the relationship with that client in general, and could lead to some worse things down the line. So yeah, I guess so go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, one thing to also keep in mind is like you want to be kind of fair, with all of your clients. So if you charge one and don't charge another, and then they happen to know each other, then that kind of really looks bad on you too. So, if you're going to put into your policies, stick with it. And again, just make it clear to them. Make it clear when you schedule, remind them about the policies, because again, even though you want people to read stuff, and I tell people to read things, they just don't. So, as much as you can make it clear, there is a late fee that I charge and what it is, that people are aware of it.
I guess you should be consistent with the way you handle those policies. If you're going to be lenient with one person, I assume it's best to be lenient with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you're going to not charge one and charge the other, it could be a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to trap yourself like that.
No. And also think about, like, I have a no-show fee and a late fee that I will charge. And the late fee is also a key one, because I started noticing that when I first started, I had clients who would schedule and then they'd be like 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late. And then it would get to be excessive, but then also then you're rushing through the session if you're trying to fit in time frame. And if I had back-to-back client, it was just a mess. So yeah, think about that too.
All right. So when you actually do get the client in person, on the phone, whatever you're doing, how do you make them feel comfortable and sort of at ease with you in that position? I imagine there's a bit of, I guess you're an authoritative figure in that sort of regard. So you're probably starting off on the back foot there, where they're a bit on their heels. They're probably a little defensive to begin with. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And a lot of people come into counseling and sessions with a dietitian and they're like apprehensive. They're not sure what to expect. And they're, again, you're kind of seen as this expert. So they're coming to you for expert advice.
You're going to yell at them like the dentist yells at me. I don't have a good I think it's pretty obvious I'm not a fan of my dentist. He's a great guy. I've been going to him since I was 5 years old. But your dietitian's going to yell at you for eating cheeseburgers. That's what's going to happen. You're going to yell at me because I ate a cheeseburger yesterday. You're going to be mad at me.
That's exactly what people think. And that's the first thing that, even, for the first session or follow-up sessions, people come in and they're like, you're going to yell at me. And I'm like, I'm not going to yell at you. And so the first thing
You look like the kind of person that would yell at me.
Probably.
Just kidding.
So first thing that I usually do to kind of help my client feel comfortable is, one is the body language and your tone. So I do a lot of virtual sessions. So I do video and phone sessions. So if you're doing video, it's a little easier for people to see your body language and see that you're kind of relaxed and, you have a smile on your face.
That you're an actual person?
Yes. The phones are a little bit harder. So if you do telephone sessions, a lot of your tone. So the way you speak and how you start the client session. So, thanks for coming in today, or thanks for being on today's call, or thanks for filling out the paperwork. And sometimes that helps, just starting with a thank you, that they filled out what they needed to do. And, thanks for filling out the paperwork. I wanted to get started with maybe some questions that you might have had for me today, or, you might just start with something a little bit more casual. So sometimes I find casual in the beginning tends to be a little easier to kind of ease people into what a session is.
Lubricate the situation socially a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe don't crack a beer on camera, but, hey, how you doing? A little bit of small talk.
Mm-hmm.
That's always going to be helpful. So one thing I'm curious about is, I don't know what the average age of your clients is and how good most people that you deal with as clients are with technology. In these times, I imagine it's much more common to, all of your clients are remote at this point, but I don't know about if most people are comfortable with video calls and video call software. Have you found that to be a barrier for setting up video calls with some of your clients?
Not necessarily. And to be honest, a lot of it's because of, and again, the electronic records I use, there's many similar platforms. But the one that I have actually has an app, and they make it really simple. When they send the reminder email out, there's like a link right in the email. And when you click on it, it opens it and you just say like join, and that's it. So it's really simple.
So it's an electronic medical record system that you use. It's a paid service, but they send a link via an email to your client. They click that link and it opens a video call for them?
Yep.
Assuming they're on a laptop with a webcam or their phone or something, I guess. Yep. What do you find most of your clients actually end up using when they work with you?
Most of them use their computer, like a desktop computer. And I work with a lot of clients in like the 40 to 60-year-old range. So actually a lot of them are using desktop computers.
And they just all have webcams?
Most of them do, honestly. And a lot of it's because of their, like the work that they do, like a lot of office work. However, the electronic records that I use and the EMR, it actually has an app too. It's free. And so then people can use their phone too.
Is that app, I guess there's a desktop version of that app maybe too. We're getting in the weeds there. That's not necessarily something. What are alternatives? If someone's not using that, what might they use?
So if they're not using like a video conferencing tool, if they're not using electronic records, I should say, if you're doing video sessions, they need to still be HIPAA compliant, so secure, platform that you're using. So if you're, going at it with, paperwork that you're using paperwork versus electronics, a few things you could do. Zoom has like a Zoom for Business, and there's a couple other platforms that have.
Is that Zoom for Business HIPAA compliant?
Yeah, they have like a separate one now. And there's a few other ones. I think Microsoft Teams might have another one, but there's a few other
HIPAA compliant Teams?
Yeah,
really?
They have new ones out now. So there might be more than what I'm listing. That was just some of the more common ones I've seen recently. But
the point being, you can't just hop on a random Zoom call or just use any video editing or video software for voice and video call.
Yeah. And then the same with, the phone sessions. So sometimes, and this is where it's good to have a backup plan. I had clients scheduled for video sessions and then they can't get their webcam to work or their audio is not working. And so that's when we switched to, just a regular telephone call. But
I knew it.
Having that available and troubleshooting and just, being aware, hey, this can happen. And, that's,
I'm surprised that that's not the norm, honestly, but I'm kind of jaded with working with people in a not necessarily older, people are bad with technology. It seems like across the board, but someone seeing a dietitian is probably in that average to upper like above average with tech. I would hope. I don't know. I am jaded with people. If something can go wrong, it will. If it can be broken, they will break it.
Probably.
I don't know.
And one thing I'll say, if you're going to use like video conferencing at all, or even phone conferencing, like if you're not in an office setting, it's really good to make sure that the client is aware of kind of what the expectation is. And you would think that you wouldn't necessarily need to go over this, but not me personally, but I've heard from other dietitians where they've had clients in the car driving with their video on and trying to have a session.
That's responsible.
Or people that are like in the hospital and they, video session with a dietitian that's outpatient. And so, being able to kind of, and that's where sometimes being flexible with scheduling might come in, to reschedule.
Sure.
Like that. But,
yeah, I would say so.
Being clear about, kind of finding a nice, calm environment.
Have you had to be clear about like them wearing appropriate attire and appearing, like some guy with a wife beater with like barbecue stains and his hairy pits hanging out? Was that never a problem?
Generally not for most of the clients that I have for video sessions. However, I've had clients where they have like a really loud TV in the back. And so they're, it's super loud, but on my end, I'm like, how can they hear me?
Do you say something about it?
Yeah. So usually I'll say, oh, if you don't mind, can you just turn your TV down? It's a little loud. And so I kind of pose it like that. Most people are like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Or, things like that where.
Yeah. It helps to be tactful in those situations. Could you kindly turn your TV down, please? It's extremely loud, and I don't know how you can hear anything. What's wrong with you? Maybe that's not what you should say.
Yeah, just the first part.
You should say that. All right. So, well, that's good. So what happens if the client isn't sure what to expect? Like, how do you guide them through the appointment?
Yeah. So usually I have clients, my sessions usually start like one of three ways. Either a client like literally jumps right into it and they just start talking and talking. Or I have a client who's like, I'm not really sure what to start with. I don't know. You tell me. And so they kind of are like, I don't know. And they're, nervous and they're not sure. And so
because you're going to yell at them because they had pizza last night, a whole pizza.
And sometimes
sausage.
What's funny is sometimes I have clients who they come into their first session and they're like, I started eating healthy this week.
They just immediately confess to you their sins?
Well, it's either one or the other. They either are like, I started eating really well this week because they know they're going to speak with me.
Brushing your teeth before the dentist.
Yes.
I flossed that week. And then not for 2 months.
Or they're like, you should
floss every day.
Or they were like, I just went out to eat and did all this. And so they start talking about like all the things that they did because they are expecting me to tell them they can't do these things anymore. So it's sometimes one or two things.
Well, you are kind of a buzzkill. You're going to tell them to stop eating several pounds of cheese every week. Maybe you shouldn't drink a whole gallon of soda every day. Maybe you shouldn't do that. I don't know.
But usually if a client's not really sure how to start, usually I'll start the session and say, well, we could start in a couple of ways here. We can maybe go through what you might typically eat in a day and see where you'd be interested in making some changes, whether it's, adding things or tweaking the time frame. Or we might talk about general healthy eating and kind of see if that sparks any interest. Or sometimes I tie it back to the forms and I'll say, well, you indicated in your paperwork that you were interested in learning more about diabetes. So could you tell me a little bit more about that? And leaving it as an open-ended question is really helpful because then that gets the client talking.
For some reason, my brain snapped to a scenario where my dentist and dietitian knew each other, and my dentist found broccoli in my teeth and told my dietitian, and my dietitian was proud of me. It's never going to happen, but it happened in my brain just now. So how do you keep the flow of the session up? Like, what do you do to keep the ball in the air?
So open-ended questions, which if you have graduated and gone through your internship, you've probably heard of motivational interviewing, which includes the ORs. So open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. And basically what that is like I actually just said.
Could you clarify the oars? Because I thought of boat oars when you said that.
So open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summary. So open-ended questions, those are, could be more of like, could you tell me more about X, Y, or Z? Not like a yes or no answer. And then the affirmations would be something like, it's like a you statement. So you were really determined this week, or you were really passionate about this. And so kind of affirming what the client has done and kind of highlighting a strength of theirs. And then the reflection would be, let's say a client starts talking and they're, talking about what they ate this week, and you kind of reflect back what they said. And there's lots of different types of reflections, but you're basically reflecting back what they might have said, highlighting maybe key points. And then a summary, which I can give you an example of like a closing summary. But basically you'd be summarizing maybe key, and honestly, this is the best way to think about it. It's like one of my instructors at one point referred to it as like a bouquet of flowers. So you are all the flowers are different topics that someone might have talked about. And so you're gathering this bouquet into a nice looking bouquet. And that's the summary itself. So all these flowers are different topics and you put it together very nicely into a nice wrapped bouquet and
as
highlights.
Many colors as possible.
Yes.
I'm still a little confused as to what the ores is. I'm just stuck on that right now. I'm picturing like a man with a pickaxe mining ore out of a mountain now. I don't understand why you use the word ores.
It's just the first letter of each of those like open-ended questions.
Oh, it's an acronym?
Yes,
okay.
sorry.
Now we're on the same page now. I'm with you.
Sorry.
All right. Well, that all sounded great. I don't know why you're apologizing to me. I mean nothing in this discussion. I am merely a rubber wall for you to bounce things off of. So how do you know what is too much information for the first session? I imagine it can be pretty overwhelming if you're just coming in knowing nothing as a client. Mm-hmm. How do you mitigate that?
Honestly, that's where that motivational interviewing comes in. So asking questions and very, very cautious about asking questions because sometimes this can turn into like a Q&A where you're just, question, answer.
Where you're interviewing them?
Yes. And so that can actually create one disengagement, but also put you more into this expert kind of checking off clinical boxes. And that can
like you're a psychologist looking down your nose at them?
Yeah. And that can be really disengaging for someone. So that's where it's good to, again, like reflect and kind of pause and do things like that. But open-ended questions get the clients talking, and that can kind of help them to do more talking than you are, because often, you want to give them lots of information. When I first started, I talked a lot, and I realized that although I was sharing all this information, the client didn't feel heard. So they left kind of feeling like they were overwhelmed with all this content. And then I used to send, when I did face-to-face, I used to send them home with like a folder and like 20 handouts, and it was like not very effective. So kind of finding a balance. And this is going to vary with clients, but one strategy I found to be really helpful is I'll do open-ended questions, those reflections like I mentioned, but I'll ask the client, what would you be interested in talking about next? And kind of let them guide the session a little bit. And then that also allows me to see kind of where they're at in the session, what they've retained so far too.
All right, so let me ask you then, because there's a lot of ways to deliver information, but how someone feels during the appointment is going to have a lot more to do with them coming back to see you and them feeling good about the appointment. So you have a bit of a balance to strike there between actual progress made during the appointment and how good the client feels about the appointment itself and how likely they are to reschedule. There's a bit of a balance there. What do you find to be a good mix of like information to how much they're talking and like what they're sharing? I guess there is a bit of a risk of them going off topic here too, but then you can also think about ways to deliver information to them in a more sort of casual, leisurely way. I mean, this is a great time to like talk about, YouTube and other resources that you offer as a dietitian or, to your clients too. Do you send them away with a ton of information and homework while not going as deep during the appointment? How do you manage? I just threw a ton of crap at you, but how do you feel about that?
No, and it really depends on the client. And so sometimes, and this is where I always ask and kind of check in with them before starting. So, once we get to the part of the session where they might be looking for information from me, I'll ask them before I even start. So if they're like, well, I want to know more about carbohydrates, I'll say, okay, great. So was there a particular topic that you were thinking about with carbs, or what have you heard about carbohydrates? And kind of what it's called is eliciting, so asking what they know about something first. But in doing that, I also ask them, well, we can go over this information on today's call or today's session, but I can also follow up with you with some resources relating to this. So would that be helpful? And I'll kind of ask what they think, or I'll check in with them after I've maybe given them some information. So maybe we start talking about fiber and they're like, oh, asking a bunch of questions. And then at a certain point, I'll say, I have a handout on fiber. Would that be helpful for you? Or have you found that this was, helpful, just kind of talking through it? And I kind of ask about it. And sometimes clients are like, oh no, I've been taking notes the whole time. Or I have clients who are like, oh yes, it'd be really great to just have that information to refer back to.
So I guess it's depending on the client, it's a client by client thing, whether or not they would rather go away with more information or whether they dig deep during the appointment. I guess you play it by ear depending on your client.
Yeah.
How do you manage it if do people schedule an appointment with you with the intent to discuss a specific topic? And if so, what do you do if they veer away from that?
Yes and no. So sometimes I have clients who, and most people don't just have one thing usually. I have clients who they come in and they are looking for help on, diabetes management, but they also are interested in weight loss. It's like almost everybody checks the box on my forms that say that they're interested in weight loss. But they might also have irritable bowel syndrome. And so they have all these other chronic conditions. And that's where I usually ask. So they'll say that they're interested in learning more about diabetes. And so I'll ask them, what they've maybe had education-wise before. I'll ask them, with the topics that they've maybe highlighted, here's like if they're interested in diabetes, but they have IBS, I'll ask if they've had information on IBS prior. And so I'm usually always asking questions of what people have learned about, heard about in the past, but then also being okay with them rolling the topics through the session. And usually what I do is I jot down what they are interested in and what we've been talking about. And so I might say, okay, we've talked about a couple of different things, some relating to, carbohydrates, some relating to protein, some relating to meal planning. And so I just want to check in with you and see where you might want to focus in on next and kind of direct the session a little bit.
Okay, so you're guiding the process. If left to their own devices, some clients may just steer all over the road. You got to keep things on track yourself. I guess it's part of what you're constantly kind of tracking as the appointment goes on.
Yeah, because people sometimes they come in with the intention that they, want to know more about diabetes, but then that leads us into meal planning. Everything's kind of all connected with health and wellness. So it's really hard to pick things apart and say that, if they came in for diabetes, that they're not going to ask about other health and wellness conditions or other health and wellness topics. So, sometimes, especially in the first session, if a client gets going, sometimes they just kind of are talking about so many different things. And that's where it's, kind of my role to keep things kind of on a pathway and a little bit more clear, but also keeping track of everything else they're interested in that could be potential topics later or during that session. So if we maybe hit a point in the session where it's a little stagnant, I might say, well, you were interested in meal planning when we first started talking. So I wanted to know if maybe you were interested in circling back to that or if you had something else in mind. And so then that way they're still guiding the session themselves, but it's going back to a topic they had highlighted, 10 minutes ago.
So I imagine, with people going off topic, I fail to see how a lot of your clients don't start talking about other stuff unrelated to dietetics, personal things, their kids, their cat. Whatever. How do you manage that? What do you do? So
that's hard. Sometimes I've had clients who they start talking about something, with a child or a pet or something's going on in their life or work. That's actually usually a big one is work and work-life balance and all that. And they kind of go off on the deep end. And sometimes if it's like a minute or so, I just kind of let them go for a little bit and then I'll, check in with them. But sometimes I'll have clients who kind of keep going. And so then I kind of have to politely cut them off.
Got to reel them in.
So I just wanted to pause for a second. I'm sorry if I interrupted you, but I just wanted to make sure you had highlighted that you were interested, and I might tie it back to something that they might have started with. Maybe they were talking about meal planning and then that brought them into how work is crazy. And so I might bring it back and say, well, you shared a lot with how work has been really stressful. I'm wondering maybe if we could brainstorm some ideas about meal planning and how we can kind of balance that with your work schedule. And so I highlight that, hey, it was great that they let me know this information, but here's how we can tie it back to nutrition.
I bet it helps if you don't sound like a robot too, with your canned lines of like, if then do this and that, like as an A-B. Okay, that's some nerdy stuff. Never mind. Well, I have to wonder, I bet there are some tactful ways to tie it back into nutrition. Mm-hmm. Say, you kind of touched on it, but if they're talking about work, it's like, oh, well, what do you usually eat at work? I bet there's a way, especially if you know what they're into and what they're looking for, to like kind of bring it back. I mean, it's really easy to relate what you're eating in nutrition with whatever they're going to talk about. So there's probably a tactful way of doing it, regardless of what the topic they end up rambling on is. So if they start asking you about stuff that is outside of your scope, then what do you do?
So definitely address it. So if it's something that
do you let them know? Do you describe to them what your scope is?
Yeah. So, and this is in my paperwork that a lot of people tend not to read, which I always encourage them
Paperwork.
to. Electronic work and electronic work.
You know what we should do?
What?
We should record you or I reading the paperwork and then send them the audio file and tell them, listen to this on your way home. Then you'll be informed.
Maybe.
You don't have to read it this way.
Maybe
New
people will
business idea. Somebody get in there and do that. I'll do it first. You better get in there. I
That's
might
a good
do it.
point, though.
Hey, we should do it on Audible. Not sponsored by Audible.
Yes.
Just a thought.
So if I have a client who maybe starts asking about something that's nutrition related, but not within my area of expertise as a dietitian, that's one thing I sometimes get. And so often I'll say, that's not really within the scope of what or my specialty, I would say. It's not within my specialty, and I might kind of dive into a little bit deeper as to what they might be looking for and then bring up, maybe referring them to a different dietitian. If they start talking about something that's like completely out of my scope, as in like maybe more serious like mental health conditions, that's something that I often find like as an overlap, with like anxiety and depression.
It ties in.
It does, absolutely.
Food and mood.
It does, absolutely. Sometimes I have people kind of, like, for example, recently I was talking to somebody about stress and stress eating. And so that was a perfect area where it could just slightly move into out of my scope of practice if we talk too much about like anxiety, depression, and how that all relates to the stress.
Bit of a fine line there.
Yes. So what I actually did in that point was we were talking about, snacks and, stress eating. And I actually brought up the topic of, are you currently working with a therapist, or have you thought about, maybe working with someone to address more of those stress? And I would first, and it's usually with conversation. So I start talking to them about, thanks for sharing all this with me. Stress can really be something that, triggers, eating more snacks or not eating for some people. Thanks for sharing.
I wish I had that problem. I wish I stopped eating when I was stressed out. Not that I'm very stressed these days, but that is a high quality problem to have. Oh, you stop eating? Oh, how convenient.
Well, sometimes people that, if people have been struggling with like disordered eating in the past, that can really spiral for them negatively. And so that could be like the tip of the iceberg where there's a lot of other stuff going on that can kind of spiral into this, a lot of negative thinking about themselves. And again, this is where it would totally come out of my scope of practice. So
that's tough to manage where it falls out of your scope, because where does it become a mental health issue? And I guess you have to develop a skill set of being able to identify, all right, where does this dip into? It's no longer managing eating and healthy eating patterns. It's now a mental health issue. That's a tough thing to discern.
Yeah. And sometimes, what's hard about it too is I don't want people to think that I'm passing them off to somebody else, or, sometimes people get a little embarrassed or like, oh, I don't need a, therapist, or
that was my first thought.
Yeah.
You're going to ask someone if they're seeing a therapist. It could be insulting to some people.
Exactly.
It's generally not, it's a shame, because therapy it can be good for just about anybody.
Yeah.
It's not, the perception is what it was like 50 years ago, where if you don't have your crap together, then you're seeing a shrink. It's really not like that anymore, especially with the way just life is so complex. There's so many moving parts today that people live a strange way people have a strange way of living these days. We're entertained more and more by screens and not other people. It can have a weird effect on you. Food is getting weirder and weirder.
Yeah.
These days, there's a lot there. But,
there is.
It's a shame that perception persists.
I know. And sometimes and again, this really depends on the client. My kind of read on them is sometimes I'll say, have you talked to somebody about that recent? Or I might tie in, like if they mentioned a spouse or a friend or something, I might tie that and say, have you shared this with anyone else before? And so sometimes people will jump to, I actually thought about seeing a therapist. And so sometimes actually me bringing it up, they feel better about doing it because they're like, oh, like it's valid for me to have these feelings and want to seek help. And so sometimes then I help with facilitating the process of resources or, who they can reach out to. But again, you can kind of phrase it in different ways that it's a little bit more tactful, and that depends on the client.
Just going to move that. So, that has a lot to do with sort of being a responsible healthcare advocate, I guess. It's sort of like a psychologist or, a therapist. You guys are kind of like brothers and sisters in arms. You're meant to be promoting the well-being of people and working together. And I'm sure you've networked with therapists in the past, and you sometimes it's, passing someone off. It's one specialization to another.
Yeah.
I hope that changes the landscape of a lot of these things. Need to change in terms of perception. I don't know how you guys can best go about doing that. More power to you. If you think of something, by all means, start a social movement to advocate for all of this as sort of like one big swirling thing.
Yeah.
It all ties into itself.
It does. And it's funny because, when I bring up the idea of maybe talking to somebody, or if a client already has a therapist, the idea is not that they're not able to work with me necessarily. I mean, they may not. So there might be certain instances where they do need to seek, professional help from like a psychologist first and then come back, and work with me. And those are more severe cases that I don't typically see. But most of the time I have clients where they are working with a therapist and me at the same time. And so sometimes we'll overlap. Like I've had clients with stress eating in particular. So they'll talk about better coping mechanisms with their therapist. And then with me, we'll talk about some other, snack options and things like that. And, how exercise might tie in. And again, kind of bringing it back to health and wellness, but they're still working, with a therapist too.
What I wonder is doctors, they have a very rudimentary education on nutrition. And I imagine, maybe I'm wrong, they have also a rudimentary education on mental health as well.
Yeah.
But they have some form of education that's required to become a doctor. I kind of wonder if that should be the standard for sort of every healthcare worker. If you have a specific expertise, you're required to have a sort of baseline understanding of some other areas that are at least relevant or, kind of laterally related to what you do. In your case, it would be, I guess, physical fitness and mental health would be the most adjacent forms of expertise that you should be, I don't know, maybe required as a dietitian to at least know something about. You've gone out of your way to, not only do you have a personal trainer certification, but you've done a lot of independent study on mental health. I don't know if you have anything official on the books for mental health or not, do you?
I have a mental health first aid training, which is what I usually recommend for people to get because it not only helps you to identify people who are at severe risk right away, so someone who might be suicidal, but also, how to also help refer people and also gives you a baseline understanding of like what anxiety is, depression. And so that could be really helpful information because in our undergrad, or at least my undergrad anyway, we talked about stress, but not about mental health conditions and how those might tie in. And we talked about sleep, but it wasn't really, it detailed. So obviously a lot of it's on nutrition, but wellness as a whole has many pieces to it. So
yeah, there should be a justice league for healthcare workers where there's a dietitian, a doctor, a pharmacist, a therapist, and you guys all like confer with each other and talk about, all right, now you pass this down to your respected, your elite of your section of healthcare. It'd be cool if it was a more cohesive experience for healthcare in general and things weren't so segmented.
Yeah, especially in outpatient, because I feel like you sometimes get that more so in like a clinical setting or like if you're working for, like a hospital system. And so you have like a care team that's kind of built in a sense in the hospital, but
a care team. There you go.
But often that can sometimes fall away with like being in private practice or being a solo, practitioner is you're kind of developing that, network and that referral system, but also being able to develop your own care team with a client. So it's a little bit more work, but it's something that's needed, so.
Bit of a tangent there. To tie it back to preparing for your first client, there are a lot of things that you can run into, and maybe it won't be your first client, second, third, fifth, 10th, but these are things that you should be aware of and be prepared to handle.
Yeah.
Because it may come to it.
Yeah. And if you're not, clients are going to throw you curveballs. And so, I've been a dietitian since 2014. So almost 7 years now. It'll be 7 years in May.
Amazing.
Next year. So incredible.
But you turned 30.
I did.
So you're no longer young.
That's true. But there's been times where clients like threw me for a curveball and I'm like, or after the session, I'm like, oh, I didn't say things right. And so sometimes I'm like, oh, they came back. I can kind of feel like I fixed things.
Well, it may feel like you said something insanely stupid or crazy, but to the person that's listening, it just it blew right over their head probably. Usually that's not, you usually are more concerned with what you said and what you did than other people, because other people are more concerned with what they did and said.
Exactly.
They're thinking about the dumb thing that they said that you forgot already, and you're thinking about the dumb thing that you said that they forgot already, and everyone's embarrassed for no reason.
Yeah, that is so true. And it's so funny because I often have clients who will say to me, they'll say something like, I'm sure this is so stupid of me to say this, or so stupid of me to ask this. And it's like, no, I've heard this so many times from clients. And again, that's where you can, if you're creating this better rapport with a client in the beginning, and that it's not this clinical, hard and fast kind of check boxes.
What's weird to me is it's like, it seems like people go into these appointments expecting like Chef Ramsay and then they get Bob Ross, like that's usually how it goes. Why is the baseline expectation for this stuff Chef Ramsay? Like, you guys know Gordon Ramsay freaks out if you like ask a basic question that's kind of advanced. He like loses his mind. Like, you're gonna do that? This is raw. Like, you're not gonna do that.
No, and I think
it's not you.
I think that honestly comes from the perception of dietitians, like in clinical, and they're telling you can't have this, you can't eat bacon, you're on this restrictive. And I think that's where maybe a lot of it stems from, is that this whole you can't have this, and also in healthcare hospital settings, it's like all the things you can have. Whereas my approach is like, here's all the things you can have.
Happy little bacon tree.
Is that
just a happy little bacon tree?
Cool.
It's Bob Ross. Rest in peace, Bob Ross, the man, the myth, the legend. Love that guy. All right, so how do you wrap up a session?
So when you wrap up a session, a couple of things that I usually do, usually right before the time frame. So if my session's like an hour long and we're getting at like the 5 or 10 minute mark, I might say, and usually I kind of wait for a pause. So I'll say, we have about 5 more minutes left in today's session. Were there any other topics that we haven't touched on that you want to make sure we cover now, or maybe in future sessions, depending on the time, because sometimes that can open a can of worms. And so, that's why I might say in a future session, or I might say, we highlighted, this point and, fiber and protein and this and that today. I'm wondering if there would be any helpful resources that you'd be interested in having me send between sessions. So if I feel like we talked about a lot, I might kind of just touch base with them. But usually I try to offer some kind of summary, and then what's next.
So you said something interesting there that kind of caught me off guard. You're going to send them stuff between sessions. Do you often interact with clients between sessions, and how much do you do?
It depends. So normally between sessions, I do have like a check-in where I might send them information, but it's only if requested. So I generally, unless it's something that is requested by a client, I generally don't reach out to them between sessions unless we've talked about it. So some cases, like I've had clients where we have a session and then we have a next one scheduled 4 weeks out. And so I might say, if they're beginning stages of like goals and changing things, I might say, would it be helpful to maybe do like a 2-week check-in through email?
Like if, say, they are contemplative?
Yes. So if they're in
the second stage of the trans-theoretical model, which we've covered on this podcast?
Yes. Pre-contemplation and contemplation. So that second stage they're thinking about. So that's where sometimes I'll check in. I always ask, though, because some people don't want a check-in, or some people are like, oh yeah, that would be really helpful just to know that you're kind of checking in.
Yeah, why wouldn't you want another free piece of interaction that you don't need to respond to? I mean, why say no? I think
it depends on the client and where they're at in terms of, again, kind of stages of change. People are more in the action and going with it. They're like, oh no, I don't need a check-in.
Nah, no thanks. See you never.
And
or in 4 weeks, I guess.
Yeah, right. And some people feel like if it's not too much trouble. And so, again...
Well, if you're offering, I understand the perception. That makes sense.
But that's where you can also, again, there's kind of a fine line. I've had clients when I first started kind of overdo that, where all of a sudden I'm getting these bricks of emails of, all these questions. And so being able to tactfully say, there's a lot of things that you were asking about. I'm wondering if these might be helpful topics for our next session.
For the next session. Save it, buddy. What if they don't schedule
reschedule?
Yes.
Or not schedule.
A follow-up.
Schedule a follow-up.
That's what I was looking for.
Neither could I find
Bit of a brain fart there. What if they don't schedule a follow-up?
So if they're not, people don't schedule follow-ups for a few reasons. One, at least I find, sometimes it's because, if they're paying out of pocket.
You know what causes brain farts?
Oh.
Brain fiber.
Oh.
See what I did there?
Wow. I was wondering where that was
That's
going.
A good joke.
I was really...
Dietitian jokes.
I was really wondering.
We got them here at My Dietitian Journey.
So cheap.
That's good stuff.
Gouda.
Wow. Anyway, I'm sorry. What were you saying?
We were talking about scheduling follow-ups. So I find that people don't schedule follow-ups for a few reasons. One, if they're paying out of pocket, sometimes the first session is the only session and they try to get as much information as they can out of me as possible. And, the scheduling follow-up sometimes can be, too costly for them. And so they'll say like, oh, I'll reach out if I need you. And sometimes people do, in a couple months. I've had other clients where maybe it just actually wasn't a good fit. And so maybe we didn't vibe together,
Can you stop attacking the mic?
Sorry.
We're upgrading soon. We're going to have arms where Felicia will be able to flail around as much as she wants, and the mic will be on an arm that kind of comes around.
Yes.
Next podcast, we're going to have some different scenery. All right, sorry.
Yes. So sometimes I'll have clients who, we just really weren't a good fit, or maybe they weren't ready for, they weren't ready for this. So they maybe have a lot of other stuff going on. And so they found that they're, within the first session, they're like, I'm maybe not ready for changes just yet. Or they have too many other things happening. So they might not schedule, or they might say, like, we're in December at this point, but they might say,
Merry Christmas.
I'll reach out to you,
Happy holidays.
Yes.
I am interrupting you like crazy. I'm sorry.
They might say like, I'll reach out to you in the new year. And so they might want to change, but the holidays are coming up and they're stressful. And so they're, waiting until the new year. So they may not want to schedule right away because they want to kind of see how things go. And then I have other clients who they want to schedule, but they're like, I don't have my calendar. Can you touch base with me through email? So, sometimes those people end up scheduling, and sometimes they're kind of doing that nicely because they don't want to say, I don't want to schedule with you.
I don't have my calendar.
So it depends, on the client, but usually what I do is I leave the door open for scheduling. And so the way I usually phrase it at the end is, that we're coming to the end of a session. I might, recap on some things, and then I'll say, were you interested in scheduling a follow-up, or did you want to touch base and let me know maybe through email, or if you wanted to give me a call? And so most clients will schedule, and then some clients will say, oh, I'll reach out to you through email. I want to, X, Y, and Z. And sometimes they schedule and sometimes they don't, but it gives them a little bit of an out,
How often? Okay. So that is important to give them an out if they don't want to reschedule, but you don't want to put them on the spot in the moment.
It's awkward.
But how do you find that people often do follow up? What's the ratio?
I would say probably most, maybe ratio.
70-30?
Yeah, I was going to say probably like 80-20 actually. Yeah. Because most people, when they're ready to actually go through the whole process of filling out the paperwork, getting that first session, scheduling and doing all that, they're ready at that point.
They're committed.
Yeah. And so usually I find for me is that, if a client actually doesn't fill out the paperwork and then, is kind of being a little flaky in the beginning, usually they're not ready for counseling. And they're usually ones that actually end up rescheduling or canceling. And
it becomes obvious.
Yeah.
At a certain point, you start to see the patterns.
Exactly. Or if they're chronically rescheduling the first session or even follow-up, sometimes I check in with them and say, and address it. You can never really go wrong with tactfully addressing things. So.
Sure, of course. Yeah. So I guess after the appointment, there are some things that you need to do. I would assume charting is one of them.
Yeah.
How do you go about that?
So in general, for private practice, there really isn't necessarily this strict format you have to follow. And so we're going to link some examples of different types of ways that you could chart. But in general, I tend to use what's called the ADIME format. So it stands for the assessment. And so that includes like someone's food and nutrition history, their medical history, their body weight, their height, all that kind of stuff. And so the D is diagnosis. So if you've obviously been a dietitian or are in undergrad at this point, you'll learn about PES statements, problem, etiology, signs and symptoms. And then we'll go, and then like the intervention. So that would be like the goals that we might have set, the topics, the education. Oh gosh, looking at your face. And then monitoring and evaluation. So that's ADIME. And we'll link that down below. But usually I use a format like that. And then that kind of encompasses everything we've talked about, but also allows me to be able to kind of like see what we've talked about between sessions and see how the client is progressing. And some people use a free-flowing format, but I find that is actually the best way for me.
What's the D for?
Diagnosis.
Gotcha. All right. Let's just clarify that.
Yeah.
The D is for diagnosis. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So is there anything else you need to do after your first session?
So after the first session, obviously charting, if you are accepting insurance there and you're a provider, there will be some key things that you'll need to make sure you include in your chart notes if you ever get audited, which thankfully I've never done.
Never been audited, but always be ready. Always be ready. This table is probably real wood.
Yeah, that's good.
So you're safe now.
That's great.
That's how it works. Right?
So a few key things. One is the start and end time. So the exact start and end time, the number of minutes the exact session was. So not what you planned for it to be, but what it actually ended up being. Codes for billing, which we can talk about that on another session. And then signing your notes.
Sounds so exciting.
I know. And then also a signature. So whoever the provider was, whether it's you or another dietitian in your practice, a signature. So if it's a digital signature, it'll include like the IP address and all that kind of stuff. But if it's a handwritten signature, it could be that too. But that, and then a general understanding of what was covered in the session, goals, and how that might relate to if you used a certain diagnosis code. But there are very specific things with insurance. So check your medical policy and each insurance plan to see if there's specifics. But in general, ADIME tends to be a good format, or SOAP notes. But if you're in private practice, you could be a little bit more flexible.
SOAP notes. That's fun to say.
Yeah.
SOAP notes.
Subjective, objective. A is assessment and plan.
With these acronyms, they're relentless. Okay, so we talked about quite a bit here. Mm-hmm. Essentials for starting, having things in place. You want your forms ready to go. Mm-hmm. Payment. Did we discuss payment method in the beginning?
We didn't, but that's something that's covered on that video that we did. But just making sure that you know if the client's paying out of pocket, how they're paying, when payment is due, how exactly they're going to address it, and then also if insurance addressing payments still in case the insurance doesn't cover it. Thanks.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And then we talked about like how to see your client, making sure you know that in advance, scheduling and things of that nature, reminding them of the session. Mm-hmm. I personally am a fan of the text and email for Felicia's method, and what to do if someone reschedules, or how to prepare for the session itself. A lot of things we discussed here. And then during the session, how do you start? How do you wrap it up? What do you do in between? How to keep the ball in the air, and how to wrap things up, and what to do after. So I'll leave some timestamps for this one as well. That'll be evident by anyone watching. I just had a thought. If you think of, I am forever going to think of anything I read that's educational as brain broccoli. That's brain broccoli. I'm starting that. Brain broccoli. This is brain broccoli. This is now the Brain Broccoli Podcast.
It just made me think of
brain farts.
No. It made me think of designing like a little a brain, but within the shape of like broccoli.
Broccoli?
Yeah.
Brain broccoli. We're doing it. This is brain broccoli. Free brain to help your brain.
We have a song for broccoli.
Oh, come on with that. Oh my God.
That can be our intro and exit.
Fiverr moves the train along.
Yes,
Fiverr
moves the train along.
Well, that's great. We have been the My Dietitian Journey Podcast. My name is Adam, co-host and producer. With me, of course, the legend, Felicia Peraza of Peraza Nutrition, PerazaNutrition.com, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, MySpace, Google Plus.
They deleted this no longer.
Yeah, all right.
Google Plus no more.
It's no longer a thing. I got to stop using Friendster as a joke. No one knows what I'm even talking about anymore. Yeah, Friendster's like dead and gone. But My RD Journey is kind of a subset of Peraza Nutrition. Mm-hmm. Felicia Peraza is, of course, a practicing dietitian with a private practice, many years of experience, and we are all gleaning from her expertise. It's been great. It's been fun. Your cheeks are very rosy right now.
I know.
You've been at it. This was a very dense episode. Mm-hmm. I hope you've gotten something out of it. Thanks for being with us here at the My RD Journey Podcast. Do you have any ideas on what we're discussing next?
I do, actually. We're going to talk about, should you specialize and find a niche is the correct way of pronouncing it. Should you find
a niche?
And so that, and we're going to tie that into also talking a little bit about scope of practice, which actually we kind of touched on today. So it's actually a great lead into our topic for next week.
Niche, quiche.
Oh gosh.
Broccoli.
We should probably end here.
Brain. All right. It's been fun. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.